Welcome back to my channel. Today what I want to cover is recently I taught a class where I taught my students how to use the 3D warp and the animat effects in Avid Media Composer to create custom transitions. And so a lot of people don't know this, that there are some effects within Avid that you can use both as a clip effect and a transition effect. So I want to cover that, and I'm going to split this up into two separate videos. I'm going to do one where I use the 3D warp to create a custom transition, and I'm going to do one where I use the animat effect to create a custom transition. Okay, so with that, let's take a look at my screen here. So I've created a simple sequence with just a bunch of kind of like scenic clips here. Just have some straight cuts in between them, and I want to create a custom transition in between the first two clips here. So I'm just going to play these, and we're just going to see that right now we just have straight cuts in between the clips in the timeline. Okay, so this part's not necessary, but what I am going to do is I'm going to go into my effects editing workspace. So we're going to go over here to our workspace bar. We're going to click effects. And really what that's going to do, since I don't need my source monitor right now, because I'm no longer editing clips into the timeline, they're already in the timeline, it basically gives me a nice big record monitor, and then it opens up space for my effect editor. So here's my effect editor, and I'll actually just kind of drag this over here, maybe resize, give it even more space for my record monitor. And then let's take a moment here and save that change that I made to the workspace. I'm just going to go to Windows, Workspaces, Save Current, and that will save the change that I just made to my effects editing workspace. Then we're going to go over to the effect palette. So our window right here that's holding our bin container, we also have an effect palette tab. When we click on the effect palette tab, there are 4 tabs across the top. You have filters, transitions, audio track effects, audio clip effects. So we're going to go to transitions. Over here on the left, we have the different categories of transitions. We're going to go to the blend category, and that's where we're going to find the 3D warp. And I think of the 3D warp as kind of like a Swiss Army knife of effects. There's a lot that you can do with the 3D warp within Avid. Now, just to point this out here, if I go up here to the Filters tab and go to the Blend category, we're still going to see the 3D warp. So the 3D warp is one of those effects that can be used as both a clip effect, or what you might call a filter, or a transition effect. So we're going to use it as a transition effect today. So I'm going to go back to transitions. Once again, I could have grabbed it from the Filter tab, doesn't really matter. I'm going to grab that 3D warp, and I'm just going to drag it, and I'm going to drop it on the edit point in between those two clips. So notice that edit point will highlight. But if I go just to the left or just to the right, the entire clip highlights. Okay, so I can drop it on the edit point, or I could drop it on a clip. It can be used as either, but we're going to drop it on the edit point. And now I can see that 3D warp on the transition, the straight cut, or what used to be a straight cut in my timeline. And then we immediately go into effect mode. If you didn't immediately go into effect mode, you can go right here to the toolbar at the top of your timeline, click the effect mode button. And I can now see the 3D warp up here in my effect editor. Now, we're going to keyframe this. I mean, that's obviously the point, is we're going to use keyframing to animate, using the 3D warp to animate this clip off screen and another clip onto the screen. So there's a couple ways we could do keyframes. We could either do keyframes underneath the record monitor right here in the position bar, or I could use the keyframe graph over here on the right side of the effect editor. We're going to do this twice, so I'm going to start with a basic keyframing or simple keyframe underneath the record monitor. So when we're in effect mode, I like to see a little bit of extra space around my image as I'm working, because we're going to be keyframing one of our clips off the screen. So when you're in effect mode, down here in the bottom left corner of your record monitor, we have reduce and enlarge buttons. And I'm going to click the reduce button a few times here, until I've got a lot of extra space around the clip that I'm working on. That way I can see as I'm animating this clip off of the screen here. Then we're going to grab our playhead underneath the record monitor, and we're going to drag it all the way to the beginning of the clip right there. We want to make sure we're parked on the first frame of the clip, and then we're going to add a keyframe. So once again, when you're in effect mode, you're going to see some different buttons underneath the record monitor here. One of them is the add keyframe button. I'm going to click on that, and it's going to add this pink triangle. That's our keyframe at the playhead location. And we're basically saying at this point in time, this is where our clip is. It's at this position. It's in the middle, basically in the middle of the frame, completely filling the frame at the beginning of this clip. But then we're going to drag our playhead to the end of the clip, all the way to the end, to the last frame, and we're going to add a new keyframe. So I'm going to click the Add Keyframe button again. And when I do, the new keyframe is the active keyframe. If you look at it, it's pink. The keyframe at the head of the clip right now is gray. Okay, so that means this pink keyframe, this is the active keyframe. Any changes that I make now are only going to affect this keyframe. So we're going to keep this real simple. I'm just going to go up to my image here in the record monitor, and I'm just going to click, and I'm going to drag it diagonally off the screen. And that's going to create animation between the two keyframes. It's going to interpolate what needs to happen beyond this, between this point and this point, to create the animation. So now, if I drag my playhead in between the two keyframes, we can now see that that is animating off the screen. Okay, but let's exit effect mode and take a look at this. So now that I've created the animation, this part's optional, but I am going to go ahead and click the enlarge button until that fits the frame. Then to get out of effect mode, the easiest way to get out of effect mode is to simply click in the time code bar or ruler area of the timeline. I'm going to drag my playhead back and check it, but when I do, that's not right. That's not what I'm looking for the effect to look like. It's kind of like popping on the screen and then moving off and then popping on again. We're not quite done, in other words. Okay, so we need to change one more thing in our 3D warp for that to look correct. So we're going to put our playhead back over the 3D warp in the timeline, and we're going to go back into effect mode. So we're going to click the effect mode button right there. And what I need to do is I need to change which clip is considered the foreground, the one in front, and which clip is considered the background, the one in the back. Okay, and this we find underneath the foreground setting over here in the 3D warp. So obviously a lot of settings in the 3D warp. So far the only thing that we've done is we've changed position. But we're going to go down to foreground. There's a little disclosure arrow right there. And we're going to simply swap the sources. Basically, which clip is considered in front, which clip is considered in the back. I click that checkbox right there, and now the effect is going to look the way we want it to. I'm going to go down to the timeline. I'm going to click on the timecode bar. That will take me out of effect mode. I'm just going to drag my playhead back and check it. And now I've created a custom transition where that picture animates off the screen. Okay, now we're going to do it again, but we're going to really do a little bit more advanced keyframing. We're going to make the image actually kind of like fly off the screen. It's going to go one direction, it's going to rotate, and it's going to move off the screen. So now we're going to keyframe a few parameters. And when you're doing this, it's best to do it in the keyframe graph on the right side of the effect editor. Okay, so we're going to go over just to the next edit right here. We're going to go up to our effect palette. We're going to grab that 3D warp And once again, we're going to drag it on the edit point in between the two clips. We've now dropped that 3D warp on the edit point. If you actually drop it in the wrong place, you can always just put your playhead over the 3D warp, click the remove effect button. So if I had accidentally grabbed that and dragged it and dropped it, whoops, let me try that again. If I kind of accidentally dropped it on the clip instead of the transition, just put your playhead over the effect and hit the remove effect button. Okay, so let me grab that 3D warp, drag it back onto the edit. Make sure my playhead's over that 3D warp, and then I'm going to go back into effect mode by clicking the effect mode button. And now, instead of keyframing, doing basic keyframing underneath the record monitor, we're going to use our keyframe graph. Okay, so we can see our playhead right here, and I can click and I can drag it where I want to put it within the clip. And we are going to start at the head of the clip here. Now, we want to keyframe certain parameters, and there are several different ways we could approach this, but here's probably what is the easiest way to do this. I'm going to dial up any attributes that I don't want to keyframe. Okay, so I still had foreground dialed down from the previous demo here. I don't want to add keyframes to foreground. So I'm going to click this little arrow, you might call a disclosure arrow to the left of that, to kind of hide those controls. And then we're going to open or dial down the arrows for scaling, rotation, and position. Scaling, rotation, and position. And these are the attributes that we're going to keyframe to create our custom transition. So we're opening those controls. This is called opening the controls. When you're clicking that little arrow to reveal the controls, those are now open controls or open parameters. Then I'm going to go down to the bottom left corner of my record monitor. I'm going to hit the reduce button, in this case probably about 3 times, once again just so I can see a lot of space around that image as I'm working. Now to keyframe. We could do this. My playhead is at the beginning of the clip. I could go to each parameter. I could go to scale, right click, add keyframe. And then I could go to rotation, right click, add keyframe. And then I could go to position, right click, add keyframe. Okay, but we don't have to do that. We can now go down to this keyframe button here at the bottom of your effect editor. And when you click it, it's going to give you some choices of where you want to add the keyframes. And because we've opened those controls, opened those parameters that are referred to as groups, we can say add to open groups. And it's going to automatically add the keyframes to any groups where you've got that disclosure arrow dialed down and you can see the controls. Okay, and once again, we're saying at this point in time, our scale is here, 100. Our rotation, no rotation, 0, and our position's at 0 in the middle of the screen. Okay, then we're going to go to the middle of the clip. I'm just going to grab my playhead. Let's put it right here, middle of the clip, and we're going to add a new keyframe. So let's go back down to that add keyframe button, click it, add to open groups. We've now added a new keyframe in the middle of our clips. Those keyframes are now the active keyframes. Any change I make are only going to affect this keyframe. They're not going to affect the previous keyframe. Okay, so I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to go up to scaling. I'm going to check the box for fixed aspect. That means I'm scaling both the X and Y parameters at the same time. X is basically left and right, Y is up and down. Just going to grab that, and let's just drag this down, I don't know, let's try maybe about 50. I'm just kind of eyeballing it. And then we'll come back to rotation, but my X position, I'm going to move a little bit to the left, not all the way, and the Y position also a little bit to the left. And that's going to kind of put that image kind of down in the bottom left corner of the image, not all the way off the screen because we're not done yet, and we've also scaled it down. Okay, so if I grab my playhead and drag it in between those keyframes, we can see that that's kind of, starting to move off the screen. But then let's have a little fun here. Let's take our Z rotation, drag it, a little bit, maybe to the left. The X position, maybe drag it a little bit to the right. Have fun with it. Also do your Y position or Y rotation. And now not only is it going to move and scale down, it's also going to rotate. It's going to kind of spin. Okay, and then for fun, let's go all the way to the end of our clip. I'm going to drag my play to the end of the clip, and I'm going to add a new keyframe there. So I'm going to go back to the Add Keyframe button. We're going to click it, Add to Open Groups once again. And then let's do this. Let's go to Position, and I'm going to move my position back over to the right. Let's take it all the way off the screen. Let's take our Y position and drag it over to the right. Maybe something like that. And then let's take our scale. Maybe not take it all the way down, but let's take it a little bit smaller. Not all the way, because it's going to be off the screen by this point, so it doesn't need to go all the way down. And then once again, maybe adjust your rotation a little bit more so it'll keep rotating. You can kind of experiment with this. And then I would probably just grab my playhead and kind of get an idea of what this is going to look like. And this time, before we exit effect mode, we need to swap the sources again. Which clip is going to be on top, which clip is going to be on bottom. Otherwise, it's not going to look the way we want it to. So let's go down to our foreground, click the disclosure arrow, and once again, we're going to swap sources. I'm going to click the enlarge button to make that fit back into the screen. Click on that about 3 times. And then I'm just going to click in the timeline on the timecode bar to exit effect mode, drag my playhead back, and check my work. And there's my custom transition. And then finally, if I love that transition and I want to use it over and over again, you can save it. So the way we save our effects is we simply drag them from the effect editor into a bin. Okay, so I'm going to put my playhead back over this transition. I'm going to go back into effect mode. I'm going to go up here to my bin container, bring that back to the front, and I've already created a bin in this project. I've called mine saved effects. You can call it whatever you want. My effects, custom transitions, anything like that. I'm just calling mine saved effects. And what I can do is I can go to the top of my effect editor where it says 3D warp. And I can grab the little 3D warp icon to the left of that. And I can just click and drag that into a bin. And now I've saved my custom 3D warp. At this point, it's a good idea to rename it, give it a good description. I'm just going to call this fly off transition. And then I can simply drag this onto another edit point. So I'm going to grab this from the bin. I'm going to drag it onto the next edit over. I'm going to click on the timecode bar to exit effect mode. And then I'm just going to drag my playhead back and take a look at it. And there is my custom transition. Okay, so that is how you can create a custom transition with the 3D warp effect in Avid.